and then Professor Rob Lynch, also from Australia, but from the University of Technology, Sydney. And each of our speakers is very well qualified to talk on the subject of culture and community. Each has chosen a slightly different theme, and we hope that they will speak for somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. We're not quite sure exactly how long as yet, but we have plenty of time. And following the 4 presentations, we'll then open up for questions and discussion. And I hope that there will be some discussion, because I think there are many issues that have grabbed our attention before and during this conference. And Malaysia itself seems like a very fitting place in which to host such discussions, because these debates are clearly at the forefront of current political thinking in this country and around the world. And since I arrived here last week, I've been following many debates that have been connecting culture and community. And these have included debates addressing issues of whether Chinese schools in Malaysia should teach mathematics and science in English, whether there's indeed a Malaysian identity or a series of multicultural identities, and how Malaysia's diverse cultural and religious heritages can be preserved in harmony rather than in conflict, as is the case in so many other parts of the world. So I think this is a very useful and befitting location in which to have these discussions. And I actually think there are many things that those of us from the West could learn from some of the ways in which Malaysia has managed its multiple cultural identities. And I hope that we'll be hearing a bit more about that this morning from at least one of our speakers, and possibly more. So I think that's all that I need to say at this stage. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Josephine Burden from Griffith University in Australia. And I've known Josephine for some years, partly in her role as chair of the Commission on Women and Gender for World Leisure, but also through her work on community development, cultural development, and arts development. And Josephine has brought, I think, a very innovative approach to leisure studies, and has built many bridges between the leisure studies community and arts and cultural development academics and practitioners. And her work always has a very applied and practical focus, and I hope that we might hear about some of those foci in her talk this morning. So without further ado, Josephine, I'll invite you up to the podium. Unless, of course, you'd like to stay where you are.
I was thinking I would talk happening here. What are the implications of what's happening right now in terms of my actions that have significance for how I live my life? So we theorize about the world as we reflect on our actions and plan our further actions. But taking action enables us to engage with the building of local communities and with local culture. However, unless we theorize about that local action, about what we're doing at the local level, we're unable to influence beyond the immediate and the local. So unless we think about what's going on right here and now at this moment, we're unable then to take that into the future and make a difference in other contexts. So far at this conference, we've looked at some of the ways in which global forces influence local action, but we haven't yet clearly addressed how local action might influence global abstractions. So, in response to my second question, I'm suggesting that we need to act locally, but in order to ensure that our actions influence the global as well as the local, we have to articulate our actions in a form that can become part of global discourses. So this leads me back to my first question. So we as leisure professionals, and more particularly in this context here, as members of this community called World Leisure, We are in a position to support the influence of local voices more widely. But our processes and practices within the community of world leisure must take account of principles of community development in order for that influence to happen from the local to the global. And to do that, we have to take account of the relationships between people and also the relationships between people and the social systems, the culture within which people operate. So community, both community and culture, if they're about anything, and they tend to mean all things to all people, but if they're about anything, they're about relationships between people. And they're also about relationships between individual people and the social systems within which those people operate. Now, in thinking about those relationships between people that constitute community and constitute culture with a small c, I've found useful a model that's been developed by Dalmau and Dick, but it comes up, other people talk about it too, which is a model called collaborative individualism. And there the notion is that we think in terms of a grid where on one axis of the grid is the relationship between person to person relationships, what they are guided by. And that can either range from competitive, where one person's gain is another person's loss, to collaborative, where one person's gain is another person's gain. So that's in terms of person-to-person relationships. And then on the other axis, we have the relationship between the person and the system, the social system within which they're operating. And that can range from an individualist relationship where the individual is valued more highly than the social system, or it can move towards a collectivist position where the social system is valued more highly than the individual. Now, you can probably immediately begin to see where particular systems would be located on that grid. So the system that we tend to be operating most under in terms of our Western locals is a capitalist kind of system which theoretically locates itself in a competitive environment but individualist, where the individual is valued more highly than the system. But my sense of it is that in terms of globalization, what is tending to happen is that is moving towards another quadrant of the grid where we are still relating to each other competitively, but the system is valued more highly than the individual. So with multinationals and so on, it's the system that is valued over and above the individual. Now, what we haven't explored strongly, I believe, is another quadrant where people relate to each other collaboratively, but within that collaboration, the individual is valued more highly than the system. And it's at that quadrant that I'm particularly interested in operating. That's the quadrant that I feel can be most effective in terms of creating space, giving voice for the local to influence the global, that other way of influencing. So the idea of collaborative individualism as a foundation for our practice as leisure professionals has also to be informed by two more ethical perspectives, and I'm just going to gloss over these because they've been mentioned frequently up till now, but I still think it's important that we mention them so that we're not building a model in isolation from a context. And these two ethical perspectives are the ecological and also the ethic of social justice. So those two perspectives need to inform us, our practice. And the principles involved here have been mentioned already at the conference. So from an ecological perspective, we have to consider holism, sustainability, diversity, and equilibrium. And from a social justice perspective, we have to consider the 6 principles of structural disadvantage. And by that, I mean that we can no longer operate in a world where we blame the victim for their disadvantage. We have to be critical of the social system that structures that disadvantage in one way or another. The second principle is that of empowerment, and that notion has been overused, I agree, but it's still a useful notion in terms of enabling people at the local level to take control of their system and their social environment. And then needs, rights, peace and non-violence, and participatory democracy are now words that I've just gone zoom and just gone straight through them, but they need to be mentioned and thought about. So they're fine words, but how do we put them into practice? And in the system that I use a model in terms of community cultural development, which is based on community development practices, but I also try to take account of the use of culture in the sense of art form practices, collaborative art form practices, but also culture in the sense of all of those codes and rules of behaviour that link us together and inform the way we operate in relation to each other in our communities. And so within that model of community cultural development, I believe we have to always be working on 2 fronts. We have to work on the front of personal growth, and that is the front that leisure has most emphasised. In leisure studies and leisure management, we've tended to emphasise personal growth, the individual, freedom of choice at individual level. But I think that we also need to be operating on the second front, which is that of social change, that we need to be taking actions that change and influence the community in which we are operating. It's no longer enough for leisure to continue to perpetuate a conservative way of keeping people happy and contented in their place. We also need to be thinking about how we can inform our leisure opportunities in ways that enable people to speak out about what their community and the way in which they live their lives. So those 2 things need to be going on at the same time as a means of working against the disempowerment that comes from lack of choice that often arises from distance from decision-making. The more distant people are from the decision-making that affects their lives, the more they tend to operate in a situation of disempowerment. So I'm going to very quickly race through all of the kind of actual practices that we can take in working on those 2 fronts, and simply suggest that the ultimate goal that we're trying to work towards is one not only where we have self-actualized individuals, which is often the language of leisure, but we have self-directed communities. And the 2, to me, go hand in hand and inform each other. So, just to summarise, I'm sorry. So what I've suggested in this 10 minutes, or maybe a little bit more, is that both community and culture are about relationships between people. And we, as leisure professionals, should facilitate both personal growth and collaborative decision-making by the people who are most affected. We have to make space for all voices to be heard.
Thank you very much, Josephine. That was a wonderfully insightful account of, as you put it at the start, the dialogue or the dialectic between the local and the global. And I think that's set us up nicely with a global vision through local action. And we decided we'd take the presentations in a particular order, working from some of the larger, more general, macro concepts, working down through to the specific, and ending at the end of this table with some commentary on virtual communities. And I think, Josephine, that was a wonderful scene-setting talk, and there's no way I would have stopped you early, because I think that's given us lots of food for thought. And perhaps you could keep some of those ideas and themes and theories and concepts in your mind, and we can come back to them after we've heard our next three speakers. So thank you very much. Our second speaker, addressing a slightly different form of cultural development, is Lawrence Lowe. And Lawrence has been very active on a number of fronts, and I'd just like to read through some of his recent work and major achievements so that you have a feeling for his involvement and his commitment to culture and community development. And Lawrence is a graduate of the Architectural Association School of Architecture in London and has been operating his own design practice in Penang since 1983. He believes that to be an architect is to take a position, and the position that is taken should be articulated through his work, the projection of his ideas, and through his advocacy within his work. His practice continually strives for design excellence, but I think, as you'll see, his work goes beyond just built design. Since 1985, Lawrence has expressed his concerns for the vulnerability and protection of our cultural heritage and the historical built environment. From modest experiments, and I think he calls them modest, but I'm not sure that they are. From modest experiments, he now leads in the field of conservation in Malaysia, where his expertise is constantly sought both by private bodies as well as by government agencies. The highlight of his working career is the recognition that he has recently been accorded by UNESCO, the Cheong Fat Se Mansion project, a conservation project led by him, which has been acknowledged as the most excellent project in the inaugural UNESCO Asia Pacific Heritage 2000 Awards. In 2002, he won a further award for his restoration of Malaysia's oldest Chinese temple in Malacca. He's Deputy President of Badan Warisan Malaysia, a member of the Penang State Heritage Committee, a member of the Penang State Museum Board, the Chairman of the Penang Art Gallery, and a technical advisor to the Penang Heritage Trust. He presently serves on the Urban Renewal Authority of Hong Kong's Conservation Advisory Panel. So I think moving from Josephine's involvement in arts and cultural development through to architecture, the built environment, and cultural development and heritage. If I can welcome Lawrence to say some
Thank you
words.
Very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. Thank you, Cara. I'm very happy to be here. I was given, I think, 1 day's notice to put something together. I thought the best way for me to get on with it is to respond to what maybe perhaps Josephine has just outlined. I'm very grateful that she has laid out this fantastic perspective, which means that I can keep to my 5 minutes. If I get carried away, please let me know. There are so many issues to talk about. I'm involved in so many different facets of cultural heritage. Actually, I don't know where to start. But I was quite taken by the term leisure professional. This is the first time I've heard it in all my years of working. Maybe I'm a leisure professional as well, because I'm looking at cultural heritage and how it impinges on tourism and having to spend a lot of time with tourism people. In one of the projects I do, we actually facilitate historical tours. And so, can I call myself a leisure professional too? Okay. Maybe let me start by telling you what I've been doing or what we are involved in, since many of you are not from Malaysia. The position of cultural heritage conservation is in fact a fairly new position in Malaysia, if you think about it. I've been working in advocacy for about 17 years. It's only been in the last 5 to 6 years that the word heritage has become a common buzzword. You speak to someone on the streets in Malaysia today, you say, "Are you interested in heritage?" They'll say, "Yes." But you ask them what heritage is, perhaps they don't really have a very good definition of it. If you talk about conservation, they will say, "Yes, we understand that conservation of our physical legacies have to be undertaken." But whose version of conservation they are very, very often unable to articulate. I was asked, basically the theme, I was asked to look at how to maintain and develop local culture in the global context. And I looked at the present conference and I said, what has leisure to do with cultural heritage? So I pondered on that for quite a long time. And I guess trying to even define the word culture, everybody has a very different perspective on it. But maybe just let me share my perspective of what culture means in terms of cultural heritage and its conservation. I like to think of culture as an issue of roots and roots, how people have traveled throughout the world, how people have moved out from their places of origin, the routes that they have taken, and the stories are fantastic, the discovery of Malaysia, how the West, both the West and the East came and stopped over in Malacca. And the other issue of roots, of how these people who have come to a Pacific place, put down their roots, brought their culture to the place, developed it, maintained it, and allowed it to become diffused into the environment. And I find that gives me a perspective which normally I think a lot of people would not have considered. The idea of roots and roots also stops you from thinking about politics, stops you about being particularly focused on very specific interpretations of what culture is. Not to be critical, but I think you have seen our ads which says Malaysia, truly Asia. And you have 4 pretty women on the poster. And I can't figure out where they're from. Except that it's truly Asia. And that is maybe, in the leisure tourism industry, that's the way they think that they should promote Malaysia. Unfortunately, I think I tend to disagree with that. What have we been doing with cultural heritage conservation in Malaysia? Maybe I just can read from a pamphlet which the Penang Heritage Trust has written, and it actually outlines what we've done. And maybe any of you interested, I could talk about it more later. We have produced a pamphlet which says Penang Heritage Trust. It says, taking on the challenge to preserve heritage for future generations, to unify a city fragmented by uneven development, to restore human scale and urban space, and to reestablish a cultural vibrancy for diverse communities. And I think everything that has been encapsulated in this, Josephine has spoken very, very well about. What we try to do in our programs in Penang and throughout Malaysia now, one is we look at urban revitalization as a strategy for people-orientated development. We are very concerned about maintaining cultural diversity and awareness. We concentrate on historical acknowledgement and architectural preservation. We look at regeneration of the inner city portions which have become depopulated. We are very concerned that heritage conservation should be community-based. And we are also very concerned that tourism initiatives should be sustainable. So this is in general what we have been doing in the country. We have been developing many local public interest promotions. So we look at education, we create specialist heritage tours, we do work with UNESCO and other international bodies. We try to get involved in consultative roles in state and local government processes, which we feel is very important. And in Malaysia, I think if you need your voice to be heard, you have to be within the bodies that make the decisions. We develop very extensive local networking contacts, and we develop also strong international networking contacts. And through the networking, we actually widen our scope, widen our understanding, and do not go on this very narrow path of just saying that we're looking at architecture and communities, but we, in fact, start to look at complete issues holistically. And we try and carry out physical work to showcase what good restoration is all about. So that's generally what the Heritage Trust of Penang and Malaysia try to do in our programs. I'd just like to touch, and I think it was mentioned that, we have to be local to influence global. I think for us here, we'll try our best for the local to influence the local. And if we can manage that, I think in this lifetime, we'll be very happy. I'd just like to respond to what Josephine spoke about. She spoke about developing the difference between developing leisure for individuals, and which is a conservative aspect, as she mentioned, and whether now we should actually look at what she called self-directed communities and looking at how to look at social change. One comment I'd like to make is I've noticed that our leisure consultants in this country have a very different view of from actually the cultural heritage managers, although I think both can work hand in hand. And at a recent conference in Penang, they did organized by the private sector. All the tourism and leisure consultants and professionals who attended, all of them concurred that for Penang, they saw tourism as a combination of everything, of sun and beaches, of cultural heritage, of ecotourism. Anything that exists in the state, they wanted to put it all into one package. And what I realized was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of the local leisure professionals, maybe in Penang, maybe not so much in Malaysia or KL, they're very conservative, and they are only looking at what they know. So when you try to introduce new concepts or new ways of looking at how to promote tourism, they actually are resistant to it. So the Penang state government is actually now proposing that Penang become a World Heritage Site. We have been spending the last 2 years putting together a dossier. We've been trying to inform the community about our objectives. But yet, and yet the tourism industry is, which we thought would be the first to jump on the bandwagon, in fact is the last. They are now resisting that. And this came as a shock to me last week. I thought, this is one more way to introduce tourism and leisure into a system which at the moment does not take cognizance of it. I think that last point, I appreciated what Josephine had to say. I think I better end here. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you, Lawrence. I think that's given us some further insights into local action and local initiatives and links between policy and practice. Josephine, I think, introduced us to some of the links between theory and practice. And we're now going to move on to look at some further links. Our third speaker, Ranjit Kaur from Malaysia, who is ideally placed to talk about the links between the global and the local, because Ranjit is the Vice President of the International Association for Community Development, so addressing international issues and community and local issues. And like Lawrence, Ranjit has also told me that she has studied in London in the UK, and she has a Master of Science in Community Disability Studies from University College London. Her current job is as manager in public affairs projects in a corporate firm where she manages and executes community development projects. And I hope we might hear some information about those projects from your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. Well, good morning to all of you. What I'm going to talk about is a little more specific as compared to what Lawrence and Josephine had just spoken about. I'm just going to go down to very, very basic issues, for example, families, and how the context of families developing over time in Malaysia create an impact within community development in the country. There is no way that you can stop communities from developing. It's a very dynamic issue that you're looking at. You cannot stop at one time and say what's happening now, because by the time tomorrow comes, it's something else. Some of the changes that we go through over the years may seem very subtle in the short term, but in the long term and through generations, you could see that certain ways of life can threaten the existence of specific cultures towards extinction. I think Lawrence talked a lot about the buildings and things like that, and he's talking about such physical legacies, and I'm talking more about family and cultural values. We take a simple example of globalization where there is more demand for employment in the urban areas, and in such situations there is a migration of the youth and women who are of childbearing age to go into urban setups. The very first instance of this breaks down the family structure of a joint or even an extended family. What happens to this family? It turns into a nuclear family, and within this nuclear family, the child is sent to a childminder while the parents are off to work. The child then loses certain aspects of growing up in a family where usually in the past a child would learn his or her own language, his or her own mother tongue from his parents or grandparents, or even from the extended family members. The environment has changed, traditions have differed, and parents speak to the child in a different language. Some are speaking, in the context of Malaysia, it will be some are speaking in English and some are speaking in the Malay or the Bahasa Malaysia language. Now, what happens then? With language, we lose a lot of other areas of our lifestyle. We have various cultural activities within our own communities, and each community has specific activities. If I were to just give a few examples, the Chinese communities traditionally burn incense or joss sticks, and they offer offerings to the deities, which in today's generation, if you see the younger communities, you see the nuclear families, it is being lost. They're not practicing, many of them, because they've moved away from the rural areas, come into the urban areas, and picked up a lifestyle that's different from their normal, previously traditional lifestyle. If you look at the Malay families, lighting of the lamps on certain nights of the fasting month is practiced still in the rural areas. I have not seen that much in the urban areas. Among the Indian families, you have certain days of the week when they go vegetarian, and that is breaking down as well. And that's because of the new lifestyle that has been adopted. The absence of grandparents and extended family members in the household create a sense of loss of language. Look at the dress around you. If you go back about 20 years, you'll find that the women and men dressed according to their specific cultures and traditions. Today we have adopted different ways of dressing, if I may say Western, rather than traditional. And we see each other in traditional dresses only during certain occasions, but not on a daily basis. We're fast losing dresses like the cheongsam, which is very, very feminine, worn by Chinese women. We're fast losing the sari, which you can see today here. Just a couple of women that probably are from India, not from Malaysia. We are fast losing a lot of things that we used to have and we used to take for granted. What about celebrating little festivals, funeral rites, the birth of a child? There are so many activities attached to all these. There is this breakdown of a fragile balance of, are we going to say we are one as a united Malaysian community, or do we say we have three very diverse, concentrated communities that have a culture of their own? Which one do we take? What do we say? It is a question I'm asking. Leisure activities, for example, like playing traditional games, are slowly losing their essence. People prefer to play golf, tennis, and badminton rather than playing the top or flying the kite. We're losing that. And of course, the next speaker will be talking about computers and IT. And you find that there isn't much interaction among family members at the end of the day because the child is happily sitting in front of the PC. The mother has to quickly cook the food and serve everybody food. And I think that is a very typical Malaysian lifestyle in the urban setup. So our traditional activities really depend on our local lifestyles. And as we're changing our local lifestyles, we need to ask ourselves, what are we getting ourselves into? The whole relationship, the woman who was originally the carer of children and the elderly in the family, what are the consequences of that? Because she's now in a full-time job and at the same time struggling to care for her child, and she cannot cope with taking care of the elderly because they're very far away in the village. And are only seeing ourselves opening up more old folks' homes. What about traditional issues like respecting the elders? I remember when I was a kid, I was told, you are not supposed to ask any questions. And in today's lifestyle, we encourage our children to ask questions. So which one is correct? The child being with a childminder is losing out on maternal bonding with his mother. What are we going to face in terms of long-term consequences of this? I know I can see that probably in some of the other developed countries, these probably would have been certain things that you may have experienced or your previous generations may have experienced in the past, but we are experiencing this dilemma right now. I end this now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ranjit. And I think it's useful to bring things down to the level of the household so that we can actually see some of the impacts of the developments, and I use that word advisedly, that we might be talking about. And from the level of the household right to the other extreme, we're now going to be looking at some of the modern technologies and virtual community developments, as referred to by Professor Rob Lynch. And Dr. Lynch is Professor of Leisure, Sport and Tourism at the University of Technology, Sydney. And he tells me that his research interests cover a very wide range of leisure, sport and tourism activities, including museums, gambling, computers, and he's very interested in the relationships between work, leisure, free time, pace of life. And if I can just pass over to Rob now, and following Rob's talk, we'll open up for some questions. So perhaps you can be thinking about some of the connections between the presentations as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen, and good morning. I was, like the other panellists, I was asked to participate in this recently, and I was very happy to do so. And what I want to speak about is the global electronic computer game culture, particularly as it applies to young children, middle-class children, but I think it, from what I've observed, it can be sort of generalised to much wider context than middle-class children from developed countries. When I was asked to participate here, I began to think, what could I contribute to this theme of the influence of the global on the local and the local on the global? And in ranging across a couple of topics, I came to this one because I have in recent years been introduced to electronic game culture by my young son. And I think I can probably best say what I want to say by talking about how I received this introduction and how I began to think about this connection between the local and the global. Last year I was at a book launch. It was the book launch. A friend had written a book on international development, and the argument in his book was about trying to get a perspective of internationalism into national debates, to take nations beyond their kind of introspective looking at their own interests. And at this book launch was this the man's son, the author's son, who was 11 years old, and also my son was there at this stage, was 11 years old. And the book launch was quite interesting from an adult perspective, and it went on for 3/4 of an hour, and there were speeches. And then at the end of the book launch, the author and some people there decided to have a debate about the key issues in the book. And the debate started, and these two 11-year-olds came to me and said, we want to get out of here. And I left with them. They took me across the street in an inner city suburb in Sydney to an internet cafe. And to my surprise, the author's son in particular was extremely familiar with the internet cafe, and my son also had a degree of familiarity which I wasn't quite aware of to this point. And they began playing this game. The game is Counter-Strike, and those of you who are parents will perhaps those of you who are game players will know this game. And as they played, they tapped into the local intranet, and it was clear that they were playing with and talking with the other children in the internet cafe. But they were also tapped in at a later stage into the internet, so that the conversations that they were having about the strategies of this game were not only with children next to them and in the cafe, but there also was the conversation with a child in Poland who happened to be playing the game at that time, another one in New Zealand, and from other countries in the world. And so, what it seems to me, essentially for these children was that the global was essentially the local, and the local was the global. Here there was essentially no difference. And there are a range of such games that are played both in internet cafes around the world. I don't think it matters which kind of category of country it is in the world. These games are there. And they're also played at home for those children and youth and adults who have internet access. So it's possible to be at home alone and tapped into an international community of people where you're communicating through the game and communicating through a microphone with people elsewhere in the world, if they've come into that game in the same language that you have come into that particular game. And a similar sort of kind of global connection exists with electronic games that aren't computer or internet based, and these are the games of PlayStation, PlayStation 2, Xbox, Nintendo 64, all the various versions of Game Boy. Those are the kind of main game platforms, and other copies of those, so that children in one part of the world are playing exactly the same game, thinking through the same set of strategies, competing in the same way as children in other parts of the world. So we have this in electronic game culture. We have this vast, huge culture that just in terms of the sales of these kinds of games, and looking at the thirst which children have for these games, this is a sort of vast international phenomenon. It's also within the games, the cultures that are created and through which the games are played are relatively uniform around the world, and they're also virtual cultures in the sense that for some of these games where there's internet access, whoever's playing can connect up with other people around the world and communicate with them at that particular time. And it's my observation, not terribly scientific, but just from looking closely at my son and his friends, is that their local culture is heavily influenced by this international game culture. It's influenced in terms of the talk that they have amongst each other in their local community, in and around the sports they play locally. After the games, after the sporting games, the electronic games come out. There's an influence of the international game equipment, the games themselves. These come into the local culture. The consumption of games, of course, is a central part of that culture. The mannerisms of children begins to be influenced by that international game culture, and also the music, because all of these games have a background of music, and I'm sure that filmmakers and advertisers have tapped into this and can just play some background music from some of these games to immediately get the attention of millions of game players around the world. Well, what it seems to me, I just want to make the observation and ask a couple of questions, is that in this particular case of electronic game culture, that the global is the local and the local is the global. Within this culture, there is no distinction. They become one and the same. Communities are established via internet-based games. These are virtual communities, but communities are also maintained and supported and influenced locally by these game cultures. And some of the kind of questions that I would just raise here, one question is, what is the impact of this international game culture on local community, on the local communities of children, for example? There's certainly a lot of new content coming into the local cultures of children. Talk about these particular games, the strategies, the characters and such things. Does this international game culture weaken local communities, or does it strengthen them? These are questions that we need to ask. In the game culture, this electronic game culture, there is certainly a creation of some kind of international community, and it would be worth asking, how are these international communities constituted? Is there any value to them? Are they enduring? What are the elements of them? And also, coming to the individual level, there's a need to ask what is the impact of this game culture on the outlook and development, moral development, social development, intellectual development of children themselves. There's a gender issue here, because it would be my observation in many different places that young boys dominate in the game culture, and so that's certainly something to be looked at. And the final matter sort of relates a little to a question which Ranjit raised in her presentation about children asking adults questions. Well, in this particular case of international game culture, it seems to me there's a loss of authority on the part of adults, because there are no questions that I or most adults could possibly answer about this culture. This is a culture that kids know and understand, and they have deep knowledge of this of the game culture. You would only hope that they could get the same deep knowledge of their schoolwork or their whatever, but that is not the case. with that, on that note, I'll finish.
Thank you very much, Rob. We've had a fascinating range of ways in which local cultures engage with, adopt, adapt, reshape, rework global cultures, and it would be very good if we could continue this discussion now with some questions, observations, examples from the audience. And can I ask, when you make a statement, if you could please first introduce yourself and tell us where you come from, and perhaps we can see if we can make some local global connections from the platform to the floor. Do we have any comments, questions, observations? Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rahimi. I'm from the Faculty of Sports Science and Recreation, University Technology Mara, Malaysia. Okay, my question is regarding the traditional culture. What is the speaker's opinion about traditional sport modification, which means that traditional game or traditional culture that's being modernized and played with passion? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So asking the speakers what their opinions are about the adaptation or modification of traditional, you're thinking particularly of sports, yes? Okay. Rob, do you want to?
Yes, if I might start from the other direction that you suggested in your question. In Australia, in Australian Aboriginal culture, there is traditionally, prior to the colonisation of Australia, there is traditionally an activity which is called the Prun, P-R-U-N, which was a gathering of Aboriginal groups from all over a particular area to come together for maybe a 2 or 3 day carnival, which would involve traditional activities such as spear throwing or boomerang throwing, such kind of activities. And the carnival went on with feasts and lots of kind of gatherings, and then it would end and people would return to their home places. And sadly, Aboriginal culture was all but ignored in the European settlement of Australia. So that particular activity, at one level, it would have said disappeared. But what we see now in Australia is that activity has not at all disappeared. It's been reinvented, and it's most clearly reinvented in Aboriginal football carnivals, where groups of football players from all over Australia will gather in one particular place for a time for several days, and with all of those elements of that traditional activity called Prun. And it seems a very vital way for that culture to keep itself alive, focused, to enjoy, to celebrate their sporting achievements and to celebrate community. So, I mean, I'm essentially all in favour of such activities, and there's an example where there's a very great value to one particular culture.
Would any of our other speakers like to add anything? I'm thinking particularly here of some examples from my own culture, which is Scottish culture, and the very specific and sometimes rather peculiar sports that have emanated from Scotland, and the way in which some of those have caught on recently south of the border in the UK. And the example I'm thinking of is curling, which I don't know if everyone's familiar with it, but a sport where a large stone, usually made of granite or marble, a very heavy stone, is thrown across ice, which is not a very useful sport for Malaysia to adopt. And even in England, people didn't know what this sport was until very recently, and a Scottish victory at a global level led English people to become quite curious about this sport. And there's now huge demand in England for curling stones. So I think it often only takes 1 or 2 small developments or changes to see sports adapt and grow and move across these kind of different areas. And I'm sure there are lots of other examples also of sport being used as a tourist attraction. So sports that are specific to one culture, one location, one destination actually being used to attract tourists because of their peculiarity. I don't know, Josephine, do you know similar examples in the arts sector?
Well, one of the things that kept coming into my mind as a result of that question and the comments that we've had so far is that, to me, those kind of traditional sporting activities are often not isolated. They don't just happen, that's the sport and it's there. It's part of a whole system that includes arts engagement and so on. And when you started talking about curling, and my own background is actually Scottish too, so I was thinking about caber tossing and the Highland Games that they still have, that they've kind of resurrected them as a means of celebrating local culture. And once you bring people together in that kind of context, regardless of what they're meeting around, all sorts of things can happen in that situation. So people can begin to actually talk to each other about things and maybe challenge certain aspects of their lives and so on. But so in a way, it doesn't really matter what you come together around. It's the coming together that's the important thing there.
I think cross-cutting sport and tourism and other leisure forums then is this notion of what is authentic culture and when does it become staged authenticity? Who are we performing this culture for and why? And I think there was a question.
Could I?
Thank you.
Well, I was it's a question and a statement, or there was, I think Ranjit Kaur mentioned that there is a loss of certain values or traditions, and that is unavoidable because the kind of lifestyle, the technologies that have developed, etc. And we experience that in India as well. But I think there could be a coming together also, because we find that certain forms of cultural expression which were getting lost are now coming back in a certain way, maybe through high tech even, because it's unavoidable that youth take to computer games and to connecting up with people all over the world in different ways. But at the same time, perhaps some responsibility can be taken by parents or organizations or governments to try and keep a mingling of the two together. Like we had certain festivals which had been forgotten, but somehow it has happened that they are being revived. And many a time they are being revived in a somewhat a different way. The expression can be different. There we have the enactment of a mythological story of Ram at a given time in the year. And it used to take a very community form where people in the community used to come together and enact it. And everyone knew that this is so-and-so, but he is now enacting the part of such and such. So it used to be a very participatory thing. And but now it has taken on the form of, sometimes it may have some videos or some very high-tech manifestations. And the participation has become of a different kind. So I think it's not that, and similar things are happening with regard to sports. Some local or traditional sports which had been forgotten are now being somewhat consciously revived by organizations or through government, or even government support, and by some individuals taking the action. So I think maybe it's some kind of a cycle that we go through. Not to say that the same thing gets revived in the same manner, but the values that it promotes or the ideas that it upholds, a particular tradition, are remembered in a different way. in a different expression. They take a different expression.
Thank you very much. Ranjit, I don't know if you have any examples of cultural developments that you might see as positive or reviving of cultures that might previously have been lost.
I think thanks, Kara. I think my concern really is looking at issues in the form of, its purest form of what it was brought. As Lauren said, how communities traveled from their countries of origin into a new country. But living in your own country of origin, it may be a little different. But when you come into a new country, there are certain values you pick up from there. There are certain traditions you amalgamate together, and there are some things you pick from one another and use. For example, the open house concept at the festivals that we have in Malaysia is originally only from one community, and now all three communities are practicing that, and that's a positive value that is being adopted by all three communities. There is no doubt that there are certain things that are good, but I was really looking more at breaking down of family structures, that the consequences of such breaking down of family structures can be quite devastating in certain situations, because that's where the grandparents are left behind in the rural areas, unattended, and nobody taking care of them. And the younger children are not developing the maternal bonding that they could have developed if life was a little different. So yes, there are certain revivals that are coming up, but there are also certain things that we feel a sense of loss of. For example, language. If your parents don't speak to you in that language, you'll never pick it up as a child. And when you take it on as an adult, you speak differently, because growing up with the language is different from learning to speak a language as an adult. Thank you.
Thank you. We have... Sorry, Josephine, do you want to...
Can I
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on just a small point that I picked up from both that question and the one about sport, and that's the idea of participation. I think that what we've tended to do in both sport and the arts is create an elite who actually participate, who do the sport or do the performance or whatever, and most of us sit and watch. And I think that any move that we can make that shifts that. I mean, language is another example of that. By depriving people of a shared language, we're actually then also depriving people of the opportunity to participate, to actually get in and do something. And so I think that with revival or whatever, it's the broadening of opportunities for people to actually participate in the doing that's important, whether it's traditional or modern.
There's a question at the front here.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Pansari from India. I feel about the sport culture. The sport culture as such must be developed everywhere, but the sports, individual sports that are there, they must be local ones. So the local sports must be given encouragement, and with the basis of these local sports, a sport culture is developed. The people learned previously, they used to have sports, and now because of the various developments, that is lost. So that should not be there. The sport culture must be developed. That is one thing. Secondly, about the globalization of some cultures. I can give you an example of yoga in India. Yoga in India is now becoming, it is our cultural heritage from time immemorial, as you can say, but it is now getting globalized. But then, when it is getting globalized, all other countries are also following it, and it is worthwhile following. But then, while having a globalization of it, certain rules and regulations that are there must be followed. and if they are followed rightly, then we can have a globalization of certain cultures like yoga. I would like to give you an example. I was in Germany, and there I saw a lady next to railway station practicing yoga. So I was wondering, I asked her, why you are practicing it here? She said, yes, because I'm having time and there is time for a train to come. I'm just practicing it here. So that is not the culture of yoga. The yoga must be done properly, at proper place, in proper dress, at the same time with a proper guru. So that is how the culture can be developed, it can be globalized, but while doing this, care must have to be taken that it is done in a right way. Thank you.
Thank you. We've probably got time for perhaps one more question. Go back.
Good day, everybody. My name is Rahman from National Recreation Association. Okay, I just have one question. Okay, just want to ask speaker's opinion. Using leisure as rehabilitation opportunity for youth by diverting the mentality from negative element such as drugs, alcohol, alcohol as a platform for conservation of environment and culture. Just want to ask the speaker's opinion.
Lawrence, did you? Can I just repeat the question? You're wondering whether leisure is how we turn it into something positive when it can sometimes have negative associations with.
As we know, this question that is a global problem, like negative element means drugs, alcohol, gangsterism. So what is your opinions or speaker's opinion for this kind of question? Thank you.
Can I answer it in an indirect way? I think what we've been talking about, why we are reviving sports, cultures, traditions. I see conservation as really just managing the rate of change. And whatever we reintroduce and we try and revive, it is only trying to manage how we're going to change in this world. So as the issue of yoga changes when it's transposed into another country, I think same will happen with other cultures as well. But I think, why do we conserve these traditions? Why do we work so hard to conserve these traditions? I think everybody tells us we are just pursuing a lost cause sometimes. But for me, it's to create an alternative perspective. That's all we can do. So if, for example, there is a certain global perspective which has to do with maybe the young growing up with this electronic culture, sooner or later, somewhere within the gamut of that electronic culture, they will come back to something about where their roots are. And maybe they will want to return to look for other answers, whether it's in traditional sports, international sports, or otherwise. And maybe, as Josephine says, there has to be some sort of participation. And so, but when they want to return and to look for alternatives, are these alternatives still there? So, why I fight so hard to conserve is that I just want to ensure that there is an alternative for us to look at. And if we pursue that line, then maybe, what you're concerned about drugs and what's connected with this sort of more youth culture that you're talking about, how do we just bring them back and show them another perspective? I cannot tell my child what to do nowadays. He will sit at his computer and he will go on and he will speak to other people around the world, but he will not speak to me. But maybe one day he'll say, what have you been doing all these years when I've been sitting behind this computer? Can you tell me a bit about it? Then you bring him out into the environment and say, sorry, it's all not there. Why didn't you just go back to your virtual world? So I think we need just to ensure that they can be grounded if and when they want to come back to ground.
Thank you. Would any of the panel like to give a few final words? No? Rob?
So I'll just make a comment on the use of sports in relation to drug education or whatever. I think it's important to keep in mind that drug use and drug abuse is a very complex phenomenon, and oftentimes people can move down the pathway of thinking we can use this particular sports program or this particular leisure program to solve the problem, so to speak. And so sports and recreation becomes a kind of a panacea, a cure-all. And that because drug use and drug abuse is such a complex problem, it seems that sports and recreation programs can be used to assist and have been used to assist, but as part of some overall approach to this particular issue. So where sports and recreation programs are used, it seems they have to be integrated into much larger approaches to the issues here, which are large issues, in order to be successful.
Thanks very much. I'm going to draw this session to a close now, and I'm not going to give any concluding comments because I don't think there is a conclusion, and even if there is, it certainly shouldn't be made in this session. And I actually hope that people will leave here and continue these sorts of discussions, not only over the next few days, but over the coming months and years. I'd very much like to thank our four speakers. I think they presented us with some excellent insights into all of the debates and issues that we're discussing this week. And if you join with me in showing your appreciation, thank you to the speakers. I have one announcement to make, and that is that there are a number of stalls and exhibitions taking part in the conference, and you're reminded
received the Arnova Lifetime Achievement Award for distinguished contributions to a nonprofit and voluntary action research. And that was in 1993. He's since then founded and is the chair of a section of Arnova known as Community and Grassroots Associations. Very prolific, very influential, very much a pioneer. David would describe himself as an entrepreneur. The point is, I think, that he branched off in a very new direction that sociology was not going in at that time, and indeed is still not going. We remarked the other day how absent in sociological research, purely and simply sociological research, the study of volunteers is. There is no such thing in the American Sociological Association as a section or even recognition of a sociology of volunteering. Yet it is clearly important, clearly a complicated field, and clearly one that Dr. David Horton Smith has himself begun and sent us, on the sociological side anyway, in a very interesting direction. I present to you then Dr. David Horton Smith, who will talk on volunteering and the nonprofit sector.
Good morning. Hardy souls who get up and come to conferences at 9 o'clock in the morning. When the average leisure scientist considers the range of leisure activities, the voluntary nonprofit sector is usually far from his or her mind. It's my goal here to change that in a modest way. Most of what I'm going to talk about would fall into the category of what Professor Robert Stebbins calls serious leisure, though not all of it does so. Serious leisure is leisure dedicated to some serious purpose other than sheer fun. It's trying to accomplish something of some lasting value. At the individual level, leisure in the nonprofit sector usually involves some form of volunteering or quasi-volunteering, and my paper is focused on volunteering mainly. I'll get to the difference between those two in a moment. At the organizational level, leisure in the nonprofit sector usually involves some kind of nonprofit organization or group, of which there are many kinds, but it may also involve service volunteer programs in government agencies and even some kinds of businesses. Proprietary hospitals come to mind. I'll explain what service volunteer programs are again a bit later. The nonprofit sector as a whole in a nation is all of the volunteers, the quasi-volunteers, the nonprofit groups, and the volunteer programs that exist in that nation. Looked at as a slice of all leisure in a nation, nonprofit sector-based individual leisure, volunteering, tends to look small, however important it may be substantively. Older time budget studies like that of Zelaya in 1972 found about a median of about 4 minutes a day of volunteering in nonprofit organizations, and about the same amount of time, 4 minutes a day, for religion among the 15 nations that they started. This is about 6% of the total leisure time, so it's a small slice of leisure time according to that study. A more recent study by Hill found about 2.9 hours per week in organizational activity. That's much larger than Zelaya found. This is comparable to an interview-derived estimate of 2.6 hours per week recently from Verba et al. In 1995, including church participation. So it's somewhere between many minutes a week from one study to a couple of hours a week that people are involved in volunteering for nonprofits or volunteering for the church involvement. In the aggregate, volunteer time for the U.S. is immense per year, and most of my paper is going to be based on U.S. documents. Using the Hill estimate from above and applying it to a 1991 adult population estimate, we get 27.6 billion hours of total associational volunteer time. 28.6 billion hours. Associational volunteer time is volunteer time when you're working for a voluntary association like a grassroots association, not a service volunteer program. Hodgkinson and Weitzman, who take care of service volunteer statistics, estimate that formal volunteer time for service volunteer programs was 15.2 billion in 1991. So both kinds of volunteering, for associations and for service volunteer programs, are very large when accumulated over the whole nation. Another way to look at volunteering and leisure and nonprofit and leisure is to look at a slice of all the organizations and groups in the nation. Nonprofit organizations look like about 6% of the total number of nonprofits, business, and government organizations in the United States in 1992, with businesses being dominant at around 94%. So if you look at all the organizations in the nation, in America and probably in most other nations, businesses dominate and nonprofits are around 5 or 6%. When you do a more sophisticated approach to estimating grassroots associations, the nonprofits turn out to be about 29% of all organizations and groups based on estimates in my book, Grassroots Associations. I estimated there were 9.5 million nonprofits in America around 1990, while Hodgkinson and Weitzman, who are interested in service volunteer programs, only found about 1.4 million. Most of these nonprofits that I found, or found evidence of and estimated, about 7.5 million, were grassroots associations. And I want you to learn an acronym, an abbreviation, so they don't have to say grassroots associations every time I come to it. It comes up again and again in my talk. I want to call them GAs, G for grassroots and A for associations. So people who come in late won't know what I'm talking about. The nonprofit sector has also been looked at as a slice of the economy in many nations. Solomon et al. In their Global Civil Society found a 22-country average of about 5% as a nonprofit sector share of total employment in the country, which means that the people working for nonprofits in the 22 countries that he studied have salaries of about 5% of the total of salaries in that country. But it ranges greatly from about 0.4% in Mexico to 12.6% in the Netherlands. The nonprofit sector had 1.1 trillion, that's trillion, in expenditures in the 22 countries studied, or about 4.6% of gross domestic product. So it's big all over the world. There were 19 million paid employees, amounting to 5% of the total non-agricultural employment in these 22 countries. That's quite a few people. So by all of these three gauges, the nonprofit sector as a source of leisure is modest quantitatively, but it's quite significant nonetheless. I'll try to show that in the rest of my paper. But note that the second two comparisons that I made look at nonprofits in comparison with work organizations and the economy, not other leisure. Work and the economy are dominant forces in human life and human time budgets. Informal leisure and fun, including mass media consumption, socializing, sport and recreation, etc., are dominant forms of leisure activities. Volunteering is not a dominant form of leisure activity, but it's an important form of leisure activity and has a number of important impacts on the societies in which it's found, which is in nearly every society. Therefore, serious leisure, such as volunteering in nonprofit organizations and groups, remain an important facet of the total leisure picture, and a facet that I intend to tell you about today. Some definitions. To understand volunteerism as leisure, I must first present some related definitions from Chapter 1 of my book, Grassroots Associations. First, I define altruism in rough terms as an internal disposition concept referring to the tendency of an entity to try to help others by satisfying such others in some way. In other words, altruism is trying to help somebody. I then define voluntary altruism as a special form of human altruism found particularly in the nonprofit sector, which is humane, freely chosen, biosocially uncoerced, helpee sensitive, that is sensitive to people that are trying to be helped, and unremunerated or under-remunerated relative to the market value of services, and based on a mix of self and other-serving motives. This is the central defining value or goal or motivation of my definitional scheme, voluntary altruism. There's also business altruism, when businesses do things to help people, government altruism, when governments do things to try to help people. But I'm talking about voluntary altruism, which is defined as I just said. So voluntary altruism is the motivation or goal in volunteering in the nonprofit sector, and voluntary altruistic action is the resulting activity. Voluntary altruistic action is action that results in significant degree from voluntary altruism. So my first concept, voluntary altruism, helps define my second concept, voluntary altruistic action, or just voluntary action. Now we can define a volunteer as a person who does significant amounts of voluntary or altruistic action in a specified time period, like last week, last month, last year. This is how surveys determine who are volunteers. They ask about any volunteer work done in the last some period. There are two main general subtypes of volunteers, and only one of which I'm going to consider in this paper. The kind that I'm going to consider is pure volunteers who are essentially unremunerated. They get no pay for what they're doing. The other kind of volunteer is a quasi-volunteer, where they are essentially under-remunerated for some of their voluntary action during some time period relative to the market value of their services. An amateur sports team member who receives no pay at all is a pure volunteer, the kind of volunteer I want to talk about in this talk. One who receives a small below market value stipend is a quasi-volunteer. From one point of view, nearly all staff workers of nonprofit organizations are under-remunerated relative to the business sector, and hence are quasi-volunteers. But my interests here are more in pure volunteers, so that's what I will focus on in this talk. There are a couple of other distinctions that I want to make. One has to do with the auspices of volunteering, and there's two subtypes. First, there's informal volunteers who are working on their own free of any formal group context. It would be someone helping a person across the street or someone helping a neighbor. Those would be examples of informal volunteering. That's not what I'm going to talk about. There's not much research on it, and that's one of the reasons. But formal volunteering is much more important. Formal volunteers do volunteer work in this group context and are members of some nonprofit group or service volunteer program. Although the informal volunteering is important, as I said, it's little studied, so I'll concentrate on formal volunteering. The final set of definitions has to do with the kinds of groups and organizations that are found in the voluntary sector. A voluntary group, which I sometimes abbreviate as a VG, or a nonprofit group, which is synonymous, is a group that does a substantial amount of voluntary action during a specified time period. So you can see how I follow through with a linked set of definitions. First voluntary altruism, then voluntary action, and then voluntary groups as groups that do a lot of voluntary action. And there are two kinds of voluntary groups which I will talk about. The first kind of voluntary groups I call volunteer groups, where they're mainly run by volunteer effort. Most of them are grassroots associations, GAs as I will call them. The second main kind of voluntary group is quasi-volunteer groups, where they're mainly run by quasi-volunteer efforts. That is, people who are under-remunerated but get some pay. There's still one last type of definition I have to give, and that's the Service Volunteer Program, or SVP. A Service Volunteer Program is a department of a larger organization that manages a set of volunteers who do work for that organization. Examples would include a hospital volunteer program, a museum volunteer program, a school volunteer program, and even volunteer programs for government agencies. We have in the United States volunteers that work for the Internal Revenue Service, the taxation branch of the government, and they do help to people who need to have help filling out their income tax forms, and there are many, many kinds of government volunteers. To sum up, voluntary altruism is my central value or motivation concept, and it drives voluntary altruistic action or voluntary action. In this paper, then, I will focus on pure, unremunerated volunteers who are active in the context of some fairly formal or semi-formal group. Formal, pure volunteers. Volunteerism is leisure. Studies of pure formal volunteerism in America have been done separately for memberships in grassroots associations and participation in service volunteer programs. The grassroots associations are freestanding autonomous groups, although they may be linked to a higher level organization, and service volunteer programs are these departments of a larger organization. Let me talk about affiliation and attendance at grassroots associations. One of the most thorough studies in the past decade was that by Verba, Schlossman, and Brady in their book Voice and Equality, Civic Volunteerism in American Politics. On page 63, they report the percent affiliated as members or contributors for a weighted sample of about 2,500 cases that resemble the American adult population. And they find that about 79% of the total sample are affiliated to at least one organization, and a substantial portion of all of these affiliates attended meetings. I rearranged the figures in their table in descending order of frequency of affiliation, and I've got an overhead that you can look at. That's a rearranged table from Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, and shows you that charitable and social service voluntary associations by far have the largest percent affiliated out of the total population. All respondents here are a representative sample of the United States, so we're theoretically looking at all of the United States, followed by educational, business and professional, hobby, sports and leisure, and youth organizations, rounding out the top 6. I won't go into the rest of them. You can see them on the overhead. Verba et al. Suggest, Verbidal reports separately that about 70% of American adults attend church several times a year or more. So this is another kind of volunteer activity. Going to church, participating in church choirs or church Sunday schools, or being an usher and so forth. That's volunteering also. It tends to be looked at separately from secular volunteering, but is there nonetheless. And there's a lot of it, at least in the United States. Now, the United States is a particularly religious country and probably has more church volunteering than most European countries, for instance. At the level of activity in grassroots associations, other studies have shown that about half the U.S. population is active in at least one grassroots association. Now, when I say active, it means they go to at least one meeting a year, or they have a post, an officership, or chairmanship, or on a committee, something like that. So half the adult population is active in at least one GA in America. People go to meetings and get active in various other ways, volunteering their leisure time to the group. And in addition, about the average American adult belongs to about 1.5 grassroots associations. So most people in America don't just belong to one association, they belong to 2 or 3, and some people belong to none, making the average about 1.5. Now, what about affiliation and attendance at grassroots associations elsewhere in the world? Grassroots associations are not an American phenomenon. I recently published an article on the international history of grassroots associations in 1997, tracing the origins of GAs to pre-literate tribes as early as 25,000 years ago, flourishing from about 10,000 years ago in advanced, settled horticultural societies all over the world, probably beginning in the Middle East. So, although some chauvinists in my country think that volunteerism is American as apple pie, it isn't. The earliest GAs were social clubs, often adult men's clubs in a tribe. They had their own quarters. It could be a dugout, it could be a cave, it could be a teepee. About 3000 BC, religious cults arose as grassroots associations, especially in Egypt. And a few thousand years later, occupational guilds abounded in Greece and Rome, among other places. Grassroots associations' prevalence has been increasing ever since, but especially in modern societies. There's a large jump in the frequency of grassroots associations when the Industrial Revolution takes place in a country, when a country goes from being dominated by agrarian workers to having a significant or substantial portion of people working in factories and industry. The Reformation in Europe was also a rich source of grassroots associations and other nonprofits in the form of new churches and sects. Many years ago, I edited a book that demonstrated in a contemporary way the presence of grassroots associations around the world on 5 continents. It's one of the 3 books in the series that Bob Stebbins mentioned. It was titled Voluntary Action Research 1974, The Nature of Voluntary Action Around the World. And it had sections with chapters on Asia, Eastern Europe, and Mideast, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Western Europe, and North America. So even 25 years ago, I could find people to write chapters on the grassroots associations in their respective countries. Now it should be much easier still. The focus of this international-looking book was on grassroots associations, which is quite different from the focus of Lester Solomon's Global Civil Society Project, which focuses on paid staff nonprofits where there are quasi-volunteers and paid staff that dominate the work activity. Now, these grassroots associations are in developing nations as well as developed nations, as Julie Fisher's wonderful book, The Road from Rio, so amply demonstrates. Just to give you a few examples which may not be familiar to people from first world countries, some examples of GAs in developing countries are the following. Squatter neighborhood associations, which are resident GAs in urban areas in several Latin American nations, including Mexico, and they have been successful in generating high levels of squatter participation and in attaining major goals like new services or other tangible benefits for their neighborhoods. Another example would be that 40 developing nations have rotating credit grassroots associations, which allow poor people to borrow occasionally after they have contributed regularly to the GA for a time. This is kind of a substitute for banks. They're partly economic and partly social GAs. And to give one last example, there are an estimated 80,000 Catholic-based communities in Brazil and Central America, which are micro-churches of volunteers empowered to perform the sacraments for volunteer members without a priest. Now let me talk briefly about volunteerism and service volunteer programs, kinds that are departments of a larger organization, whether a government, a large nonprofit, or even a business in the sense of a voluntary hospital. The most recent U.S. data are from the 1999 edition of Giving and Volunteering in the United States by Kirsch et al. Based on a weighted representative sample, again, of about 2,500 adult Americans, 18 years of age or older, Table 2 gives the percentage of people reporting volunteering assignments for the year 1998 by area of volunteer activity in descending order of frequency for formal settings, that is, leaving aside the informal volunteers. That's the table. The interesting thing is that there are two kinds of groups that come in the top 5 in both tables, the table for grassroots associations and the table for service volunteer programs. And those two are education and human services or social services. Those are in the top 5, whether you're talking about service volunteer programs or grassroots associations. A study of volunteerism in 14 European nations in 1990, and I'm sure there must be some more recent one, but I couldn't find it, edited by Justin David Smith, entitled, no relation, entitled Volunteering in Europe, found a variety of service volunteer programs present in all the countries of Western Europe studied, although at substantially lower levels than in Canada and the U.S. Remember, in Canada and especially the U.S., something like half the population is involved in these kinds of volunteer assignments, service volunteer programs. Volunteerism was strongest in these European countries in the areas of sports and recreation and in health, welfare, and use, and weakest in areas of conservation and animals and in community action, third world, and women. But there are wide inter-country variations. Well, having tried to demonstrate something about the magnitude of volunteering in the nonprofit sector, I want to turn to impact and meaning of such volunteerism. It's not sufficient to demonstrate that there is a lot of volunteerism that exists in leisure time activity all over the world, both in grassroots associations and service volunteer programs. Another important question is what it all means in the lives of the participants. What impact does it have? I shall undertake to answer this question separately for grassroots associations and service volunteer programs because the literature on the impact is separate and there isn't much on the service volunteer programs. I personally paid most of attention to the grassroots association impact literature. So first, grassroots association impact. Several expected kinds of impact tend to be present as a result of GA activity flowing from the structure and processes common to GAs generally in relationship to individuals and their relation to the larger community and society. In other words, it's the nature of grassroots associations that brings about the impacts that I'm going to talk about. The following is a list and general description of 5 major substantive types of GA impact, which I theorize from the research literature are most important for GAs. And I've combined some substantive impacts that could be separated in order to make the total set of impact types more compact and readily grasped by the listener. The first of the 5 types of impact is social support and helping. GAs are inherently social and interactional, usually on a face-to-face basis because of their locality base and goals. Grassroots associations are based in a single locality, a neighborhood, sometimes just a building, sometimes a town or city. They all tend to generate interpersonal support and informal helping among members as one kind of member impact. Studies have shown that people develop friendships with the co-members of a grassroots association. So when they go to a grassroots association meeting and participate in that association, they develop friendships there, which fits with this particular impact of informal social support. Some 40% of American adults, according to Wuthnow, are in small social support mutual aid groups, which are especially important sources of social support by definition. They are self-help groups, Bible study groups, Sunday school classes, book and discussion groups, political and current events groups, sports and hobby groups. Wuthnow found in his national representative sample of such support groups that they were credited by 82% of their members with making you feel like you're not alone. That's social support. And by 72% with giving encouragement when you were feeling down, which is a kind of informal helping. And with 43% with helping through an emotional crisis, among other kinds of help. So people in grassroots associations depend on each other, make friends with each other, and give help to each other. In some instances, GAs have had non-member serving goals that fall into this category of helping. And they're able to turn internal cohesion into various kinds of service activities of potential are actually used to target non-members. So some examples of this would be disaster helping groups, emergency medical service groups, firefighting groups, and crime control groups, which are in many cities. In addition, there are indigenous service for development groups in developing countries, local grassroots associations that are trying to do development. Among local religious congregations in the U.S., there are probably, most of them are mainly paid staff voluntary groups, but some are grassroots associations. And most U.S. congregations provide some community social services using volunteers, as well as using volunteers to help with the production of the church service. Second topic of impact, information and education. In modern society, especially information and service post-industrial societies, all organizations tend to create some social reality for their members. They tend to portray a way of looking at social reality. GAs specifically tend to provide both their members and much of the non-member population cumulatively with various kinds of stimulation, information, and educational experiences. Deakin and Golding performed a broad mail questionnaire survey of voluntary organizations in the Midlands of England. They showed the importance in most kinds of grassroots associations in providing information to members and others in current information society. Some other kinds of GAs have a central focus on information. For instance, book discussion groups combine provision of information with personal growth. Youth groups, youth development groups like the Boy or Girl Scouts or the 4-H, which is specialized to America, emphasize skill and knowledge development in practical areas. There are other examples. Participation in amateur scientific GAs leads to accumulation of related scientific information, as in a book by Robert Stebbins in 1979. Lawson studied social movement GA members who learned new skills and techniques of protest and political action from their GAs, such as when and how to do a rent strike. So the education and learning and information that one gets from GAs does not necessarily just come for the cooler kinds of service-oriented GAs, but also comes for the hotter social protest kinds of groups. There's a great deal of learning that takes place in grassroots associations. In addition to emphasizing experiential knowledge as the basis of their healing and supportive effects, self-help GAs in particular usually convey information to participants about the problem of focus, whatever the self-help group is set up to focus on, and how to deal with the problem in everyday life, available services, available supportive people and sponsors in the GA, and how to think about oneself in a new way. This latter matter of worldview transformation is the most extensive and encompassing process of education or information provision. The information absorbed is internalized and leads to dealing with everyday life in radically new ways. For instance, the Alcoholics Anonymous member who makes such a transformation not only stops drinking alcohol, but avoids bars and drinkers and has a new philosophy of life. Sects and cults provide similar worldview transformations among GAs. There are some wonderful impact studies, one with a pre-test, post-test control group design and a job-finding club that that demonstrate how the information from that club helped the members get jobs within 3 months, where only 65% of the control group non-members found jobs in 3 months. So there's some studies of impact that show the stark importance of information received from grassroots associations. Sociopolitical activation and influence is the third impact area. GAs often politicize their members and generate sociopolitical influence activity directed at non-members and external organizations. Members learn democracy directly from participation in GAs, partly because GAs of every type sometimes get involved in public affairs issues when they are relevant to the continued GA existence and or to specific GA goals, such as health or education or sports. GAs also politicize their members because of internal democratic processes and political discussion, which involve learning experiences for many members. The result is that active GA members tend to get more involved in a wide variety of political activities than less active members or non-members. Put in a single sentence, being a member of a GA tends to make you more political. Some examples of politicization types that have been found in the literature include more voting turnout for members, more registration to vote and becoming a political candidate, more attending of political meetings or signing a petition, creating or reinforcing commitment to advocacy work, and higher scores on a composite political participation measure. There have been some longitudinal studies to show that this is not just a correlation, but a matter of causality. People who were studied in a longitudinal study by Hanks and Eklund found that high school extracurricular activities, including GA activity, led strongly to adult GA activity, which in turn led to more voting and less alienation. GAs with internal or external goals which relate to public issues often have a political impact locally. GAs are not just internally focused, they can be externally focused on trying to do something for the nation that they're embedded in. This can come, for instance, through environmental health groups successfully resisting the siting of or operation of a hazardous waste incinerator or waste dump in their locality. Or GAs can successfully resist broadcasting license renewals and affect TV program formats, among other manifestations of local influence. One GA influenced their city government to establish a short-term care center for the homeless. Another GA affected city land use decisions. And there are numerous other possible examples, hundreds. However, GAs are far from uniformly successful in their local political influence attempts, limited as they are by local and higher-level business and government sector elites, as well as by competition and conflict with other GAs. Many countries also put legal limits on political advocacy and campaigning by GAs and other nonprofits. GA internal weaknesses, their structure, also play a role in advocacy failure, as do the kind and scope of the problem. GAs have more political impact when they're parts of local coalitions or alliances, and when they are polymorphic, that is, branches of some higher-level geographic association. The fourth major impact area that I want to talk about is economic outcomes. Nearly everyone in every GA has some economic concerns. Most GAs tend to have some revenues, however small, and these can accumulate nationally into a large amount of money, many billions of dollars. I think I made an estimate once that it was $50 billion of the budgets of grassroots associations in America. All GAs involve some imputed economic value of participant time. Let me explain the term imputed value for those of you who are not familiar with it. The imputed value of volunteer time is the value that it would have if people were being paid for that as service workers. And you can calculate that using the service wage in the country at a particular time and take the hours of participant time, and you come up with a large economic value of the time. This accumulates, as I say, into very large dollar amounts. Also, GAs can increase business and professional job contacts of members, especially males. This has been documented in several studies. Many GAs can help provide members with some relevant experience for obtaining jobs and who lack recent job skills, often homemakers returning to the labor force. Through GAs, there are many productive, through GAs, people are more productive, if only informally, than would otherwise be the case. In other words, GAs are a context in which people can be more productive than they can be on their own. Valuable practical services for members and non-members are accomplished in the community, which can reduce municipal costs and taxes and increase municipal efficiency, such as volunteer firefighting corps, volunteer town committees. So cumulatively, these economic situation improvements help not just the GA members, but the economy and the society as a whole. GAs and networks of GAs play key roles in sustaining economic development and promoting psychological empowerment in developing nations. Successful results have been obtained from GA projects in agriculture, cooperatives, rotating credit availability, irrigation, a whole slew of other kinds of impacts. And I've already mentioned rotating credit cooperatives that are found in developing nations and squatter neighborhood associations, which are able to gain new services and tangible benefits for their neighborhoods. In addition, there are economic system support GAs that have a positive impact on both members and non-members locally, although most are polymorphic, being parts of larger national organizations. Farmers groups, unions, business people groups, professional groups, all of these have special economic impact on the society in which they're embedded. The fifth impact area that I want to talk about is happiness and health. I don't really have much time to tell you about this. 5 minutes, yeah. It turns out that just participating in grassroots association has health and happiness byproducts. It tends to create more happiness and satisfaction with life and less deprivation, as well as to foster better health, less illness, less mortality or death, and quicker recovery from illness among members. Social support also lessens the impact of stressors and life crises on the individual, reduces the likelihood of health-damaging behavior as a result of the stress. So self-help groups, grassroots associations in general have a happiness and health impact on the people in their groups. And there are also special additional health benefits and happiness benefits from self-help GAs, which I don't have time to go into. Most of these self-help groups improve the happiness and health of their members. And the level of involvement in such groups is very important. Service volunteer program impact, I'll just get through very quickly and say that all but the third kind of impact of the five that I've talked about, socio-political activation and influence, tend to be found in service volunteer groups, service volunteer programs. So part of my conclusion is that the voluntary nonprofit sector makes a significant contribution to leisure, particularly through volunteerism involved. In a nation like the U.S., over 40 billion hours per year of volunteer time may be contributed through grassroots associations and service volunteer programs. Affiliation with GAs is widespread in the U.S. and elsewhere, as other studies show, as is service volunteer participation. All this volunteering has an impact on the five major areas, impact areas that I've talked about. And I'd like to say just a couple of words about the global forces, local responses in relationship to grassroots associations. First, as far as globalization, there are grassroots associations and volunteer programs all over the world. More grassroots associations than service volunteer programs, but this is a growing area. In the U.S., one aspect of the globalization is transnational voluntary associations, which are associations that have some kind of a linkage with another country or several other countries. For instance, in the friendship area, there's Sister Cities International. In the youth area, there's the Experiment International Living. In the professional and scientific area, there's the International Research and Exchange Board, and so on and so forth. There are also INGOs, international non-governmental organizations like the World Leisure and Recreation Association or the International Red Cross, and many, many others. There's 20,000 INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, and each of these tends to have many national non-governmental organizations that are members of them. Another aspect of globalization is the global history of GAs and nonprofits that I've talked about. And there is a global market as potential for GAs and volunteer groups, especially in the second world and the third world, where they're less frequent than they are in the first world. The local responses of volunteering, especially grassroots associations, include preservation of cultural identity, such as ethnic, religious, and nationality grassroots associations. Grassroots associations and volunteer groups are the content of civil society. That was a topic that was mentioned in the literature on this conference. And leisure events for these kinds of groups, nonprofits, range from INGO congresses such as this to local meetings which are held sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. So, in sum, volunteerism is growing globally in all kinds of nations, but volunteerism is largely local in scope with great diversity at this local level. Thank you very much.